Now that you've watched some anatomical directions, we're going to put some of this stuff into perspective and look at anatomical planes. So oftentimes, even though we are obviously 3D people, in order to look at images, we sometimes will section through in various ways, whether that's an X-ray, a CT scan, an MRI, things like that. And so we need to look at these in various planes. And so we have three main ones. So anatomical planes are imaginary flat surfaces. Again, they're going to pass through and intersect solid objects and break them into 2D sections. So what I personally think of when I'm thinking about these anatomical planes is if I were to take a saw through this plane, what kind of halves would I end up with in the body? One of the planes is called the frontal plane, which is the one that's in green up on the screen. So what the frontal plane is going to divide us into, if we were to saw ourselves in half, would be an anterior or a front half and a posterior or a back half. So the picture that you're seeing to the left, right here, is what you would see if we sliced ourselves, the upper half of ourselves, down in that frontal or coronal plane. The sagittal plane, the one that's in the goldenrod color here, and where letter B is going to run perpendicular to the frontal plane that we just looked at. So then dividing us into an anterior and posterior half, which is what the frontal plane would do. What the sagittal plane is going to do is divide us into a right and a left half. A small caveat to this: we can slice these in any part. So what we're seeing on the screen is all done in this, it's centrally located, but we could also do the sagittal plane here. That would divide us into a right and a left half, or here, it can be anywhere. They don't necessarily have to be symmetrical right and left halves. So if we go exactly in the middle, in that mid-sagittal plane is what we call it when it's symmetrical, and that would divide us into equal right and left halves. The other plane that we haven't looked at that is done quite often is called the transverse or horizontal plane. So the word transverse just means horizontal, so they're synonymous with one another. Another fun anatomy caveat. These are going to, if we sliced ourselves with a saw through the transverse or horizontal plane, what we would end up with our bodies: upper, a superior, and an inferior half. Most CT scans and MRI scans are going to be taken in this transverse plane, or that's what you most typically see. That's not to say they can't do other planes. So what we're seeing here would be a transverse or horizontal section versus the sagittal, which is going to be down at the bottom, and the frontal, which is off to the left. As we often have in anatomy, we're going to have a catch-all category. So if we're looking at some 2D image of the body that's not in the frontal plane, that's not in that sagittal plane that's perpendicular to the frontal, and that's not in the transverse or horizontal plane, if we're looking at a body looking at a plane like this dashed line that I just drew, that's what we're going to call the oblique plane. Okay, so you're not going to hear about that often. Oblique is just going to be anything that's not what's typical: the frontal, the sagittal, or the transverse or horizontal plane. I hope that makes sense.